Chapter 1. The Grand Gala. The sky cast a silvery glow over the British Museum of Arts. It was a grand edifice, its neoclassical architecture towering over the surrounding buildings like a temple of culture and history. Tonight, it was dressed in its finest, illuminated by hundreds of gas lamps that flickered like stars against the night sky. The occasion was one of great significance, a royal gala to celebrate the unveiling of a priceless artifact, a centuries-old jeweled scepter said to have belonged to one of England's most legendary monarchs. Jane Parsons arrived at the museum in a black carriage. She stepped out and took a moment to survey the scene. Guests in elaborate gowns and tailored suits were streaming into the museum, their breath visible in the cool evening air. The women wore diamonds that caught the light, and the men carried themselves with the confidence of the wealthy and powerful. Her invitation to the gala had come as a surprise. Though Jane was well known within certain circles for her skill in solving some of London's most perplexing cases, the invitation had been delivered in an ornate envelope sealed with the emblem of the British Museum, and inside was a note written in a delicate hand. "Miss Parsons, your presence is requested at the Royal Gala, where an artifact of great historical significance will be unveiled. We believe your expertise may be of value should any unforeseen circumstances arise. Yours sincerely, Lord Henry Fitzwilliam, Curator of the British Museum of Arts." Jane had been intrigued by the letter, though she suspected there was more to the invitation than the note revealed. The entrance hall of the museum was a spectacle in itself. Marble floors stretched out beneath the high, vaulted ceiling, and towering columns lined the walls. The room was filled with the hum of conversation, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter. Jane's eyes quickly scanned the crowd, taking in the faces of London's elite. There was Lord Andrew Marbury, the art dealer whose galleries were known throughout Europe, Countess Evelina von Habsburg, a foreign dignitary with a reputation for collecting rare and unusual items, Dr. Reginald Thornton, a historian and scholar who had written extensively on the very artifact being unveiled tonight, and Lady Isabella Barrington, a socialite whose wealth and influence were matched only by her charm. These were the four key figures who had been mentioned in the note accompanying her invitation. Jane had gathered as much information as she could about each of them. All four had been involved, in one way or another, with the acquisition or study of the jeweled scepter. It was a piece of immense value, not just in monetary terms but also as a symbol of England's rich history. The scepter was rumoured to have been used in the coronation of a long-dead king, and its journey to the British Museum had been shrouded in mystery. As Jane moved through the crowd, she caught snippets of conversation. Lord Marbury was boasting about a recent acquisition from the Far East, while Countess von Habsburg was discussing an upcoming diplomatic mission. Dr. Thornton was holding court with a group of admirers, expounding on the significance of the scepter, while Lady Barrington, ever the social butterfly, flitted from group to group, leaving a trail of admirers in her wake. "Ah, Miss Parsons," came a voice from behind her. Jane turned to see Lord Henry Fitzwilliam, the museum's curator, approaching her with a warm smile. He was a tall man, with greying hair and a neatly trimmed beard, dressed in a deep burgundy coat that was both elegant and understated. "I'm so glad you could make it." "Lord Fitzwilliam," Jane replied, inclining her head slightly in greeting. "It's a pleasure to be here. This is quite the event." "Indeed it is," Lord Fitzwilliam said, his eyes twinkling with excitement. "The unveiling of the scepter is a momentous occasion, one that will be remembered for years to come. But I must admit, I had another reason for inviting you tonight." Jane raised an eyebrow. "Yes," he said, lowering his voice slightly. "You see, there have been some concerns, whispers, if you will, that certain parties might attempt to interfere with tonight's proceedings. Given your reputation, I thought it prudent to have someone of your caliber present, just in case." "Interfere?" Jane repeated. "In what way?" "I'm not entirely sure," Lord Fitzwilliam admitted. "But there have been rumours. Nothing concrete, you understand, but enough to make me uneasy. I would feel much better knowing you were keeping an eye on things." Jane nodded, understanding the curator's concerns. The value of the sceptre, both historically and financially, was enough to attract all sorts of attention, some of it unwanted. "I'll do what I can," she assured him. "Thank you, Miss Parsons," Lord Fitzwilliam said, relief evident in his voice. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I must attend to our guests. The unveiling will begin shortly." With that, he gave a slight bow and disappeared into the crowd. As she moved through the gallery, Jane's gaze fell upon the display case that would soon hold the sceptre. It was an ornate piece, crafted from dark wood and glass, with intricate carvings that told stories of ancient battles and forgotten kings. The case was empty for now, but in a matter of minutes, it would house one of the most valuable artifacts in the world. Chapter 2: The Unveiling. The anticipation in the museum was palpable as the appointed hour approached. The guests had gathered in the grand hall, a magnificent room with high ceilings and walls adorned with priceless paintings and tapestries. Jane took her place among the guests, careful to position herself where she could observe both the platform and the crowd. She had always prided herself on her ability to read a room, to pick up on the subtle cues in body language that often betrayed more than words ever could. Tonight, she was particularly attuned to the four key figures: Lord Andrew Marbury, Countess Evelina von Habsburg, Dr. Reginald Thornton, and Lady Isabella Barrington. Lord Marbury, the art dealer, stood with a group of fellow connoisseurs, his tall, lean figure cutting an elegant silhouette against the backdrop of the room. He was speaking animatedly, his hands gesturing as he discussed some recent acquisition. Jane noted the way his eyes occasionally flicked toward the platform. Countess von Habsburg, resplendent in a gown of deep emerald green, was engaged in conversation with the diplomat. Her regal bearing and composed expression gave little away, but Jane knew that the Countess had a long history of acquiring rare and valuable artifacts. Dr. Thornton was in his element, surrounded by admirers who hung on his every word. He was a man of intellect, with a passion for history that bordered on obsession. The sceptre was more than just an artifact to him. It was a key to understanding a part of England's past that had been shrouded in mystery. Lady Barrington, ever the socialite, was flitting from one group to another, her laughter ringing out like a bell. She seemed to be enjoying the attention she received, but Jane could see that her movements were calculated. Lady Barrington was a woman who thrived on power and influence, and she had a knack for being where the action was. As the string quartet finished their piece, a hush fell over the room. All eyes turned toward the platform as Lord Henry Fitzwilliam, the curator of the museum, stepped forward to address the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "it is my great honour to welcome you to the British Museum of Arts for this momentous occasion. Tonight, we are gathered to unveil a piece of history, a relic that has been lost to the ages and has only recently been rediscovered. This jewelled sceptre, once wielded by King Richard III, represents not only a remarkable artifact of the medieval period, but also a symbol of our nation's enduring legacy. The sceptre," Lord Fitzwilliam continued, "was recovered during an archaeological expedition in the ruins of an ancient abbey, long thought to be lost to history. Its journey to this very museum has been one of great intrigue and significance, and tonight we have the privilege of witnessing its return to the public eye." With a gesture, he beckoned two attendants forward. They carried with them a large, ornate box, gilded and adorned with symbols of the monarchy. The box was placed carefully on the platform. Lord Fitzwilliam took a key from his pocket and unlocked the box. A collective gasp echoed through the room as the sceptre was revealed. It was a magnificent piece, even more stunning than the rumors had suggested. The shaft was crafted from gold, inlaid with intricate designs and studded with precious gemstones that glittered in the light. The head of the scepter was topped with a large, flawless diamond, surrounded by a halo of sapphires and rubies. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, a symbol of power and authority that had withstood the test of time. For a moment, there was only silence as the guests took in the sight before them. Jane observed the reactions of those around her. Lord Marbury's eyes gleamed with a mixture of envy and admiration, while Countess von Habsburg's composed expression faltered for just a second, revealing a flash of covetousness. Dr. Thornton looked almost reverent, as though he were in the presence of something sacred. Lady Barrington, on the other hand, wore a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was assessing, calculating. As the scepter was placed in the display case at the centre of the platform, Lord Fitzwilliam spoke again. "This scepter, a relic of our nation's past, will be on display here at the British Museum of Arts for all to see. It is a reminder of the rich history we share and of the legacy we are tasked with preserving for future generations." The guests broke into polite applause. As the applause died down, Lord Fitzwilliam invited the guests to approach the platform and view the scepter up close. A line began to form, with the guests eager to get a better look at the artifact. When it was her turn, Jane stepped forward to examine the scepter. The display case was made of thick, reinforced glass, and it was clear that the museum had taken every precaution to ensure the artifact's safety. As the evening wore on, the guests began to break off into smaller groups, returning to their conversations and enjoying the refreshments that had been laid out in an adjoining room. It was then that Jane noticed something odd. Dr. Thornton had been speaking with a colleague, but his attention kept drifting back to the scepter. He seemed restless and distracted. At the same time, she saw Lady Barrington slipping away from the main crowd, her movements subtle but purposeful. A group of guests had gathered around someone who had just arrived, their voices raised in surprise and curiosity. Standing at the center of the group was a man, tall and imposing, dressed in a uniform that marked him as a high-ranking officer in the British Army. His face was familiar. "Colonel William Hargrove," someone whispered. Hargrove was a man with a reputation, a soldier known for his ruthless efficiency and his involvement in several controversial campaigns. But what was he doing here, at a gala dedicated to the arts? The colonel exchanged pleasantries with Lord Fitzwilliam, who seemed both surprised and unsettled by the man's arrival. Chapter 3. The Disappearance. The British Museum of Arts, a bastion of culture and history, hummed with the conversations of London's elite, their laughter and chatter blending with the soft strains of music from the string quartet. The scepter, now secured within its display case, had become the focal point of the evening. Nearby, Lord Marbury was deep in conversation with another art dealer, but his eyes frequently darted toward the scepter, a look of calculated interest in his gaze. Countess von Habsburg, ever the diplomat, maintained her air of regal composure, yet Jane caught the briefest flicker of something predatory in her eyes as she glanced at the artifact. Lady Barrington, with her practiced charm, seemed the least interested, but Jane knew better than to be deceived by her carefree demeanor. Lady Barrington was a woman who understood power and influence, and the scepter was a symbol of both. The evening was progressing smoothly, when the lights flickered, just for a few moments, plunging the room into darkness before the gas lamps flared back to life. The flicker was brief, almost unnoticeable, but it was enough to send a ripple of unease through the crowd. Jane's instincts told her that something was wrong, and she pushed her way through the throng of guests, heading directly for the display case. But when she arrived, her worst fears were confirmed. The scepter was gone. The display case was still intact, the glass unbroken, but the scepter that had been the centerpiece of the evening had vanished without a trace. The crowd had begun to gather around the platform, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. Whispers spread like wildfire, the guests craning their necks to get a better look at the now empty display case. Lord Fitzwilliam, who had been speaking with a group of dignitaries, rushed forward, his expression one of utter disbelief. What has happened?" he stammered, his voice breaking through the rising din of panic. "Where is the scepter?" Whoever had taken it had done so with a level of skill and precision that suggested careful planning. But the most pressing question was why. Why had the scepter been stolen, and why now? Jane turned her attention to the crowd, her eyes searching for any sign of guilt or fear. Lord Marbury had gone pale, his usual composure shattered. Countess von Habsburg's mask of calm had slipped, revealing a glimmer of alarm. Dr. Thornton was shaking his head in disbelief, while Lady Barrington seemed frozen in place, her eyes wide with shock. The murmur of voices grew louder, and Jane knew she had to act quickly to prevent the situation from spiraling out of control. She stepped forward, raising her voice above the noise. "Everyone, please remain calm," she said, her tone firm but reassuring. "The museum is on lockdown, and no one will be allowed to leave until we have resolved this matter. I assure you, we will do everything in our power to recover the scepter." Her words had the desired effect, and the crowd began to settle. Lord Fitzwilliam turned to her, his face a mask of concern. "Miss Parsons, what do you suggest we do?" "We need to secure the exits and begin a thorough search of the museum," Jane replied, her mind already working through the logistics. "I want a list of everyone who had access to the scepter before and during the gala, including staff and security personnel. We'll also need to interview the guests, anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual." Lord Fitzwilliam nodded, his expression grim. "I'll have my staff begin the search immediately. What about the guests?" Jane glanced at the crowd, her gaze lingering on the 4 key figures. "Let's move everyone to the dining hall," she suggested. Lord Fitzwilliam agreed, and within minutes the guests were being escorted to the dining hall, a grand room with long tables and ornate chandeliers. As the guests settled into the dining hall, Jane took a moment to assess the situation. The museum staff were already securing the exits and beginning their search, but Jane knew that the key to solving this mystery lay in understanding the motives of those closest to the scepter. She needed to identify who had the most to gain from its theft, and who might be desperate enough to kill to cover their tracks. Lord Marbury was hunched over, his face buried in his hands. His earlier bravado had vanished, replaced by a look of despair. Countess von Habsburg sat stiffly, her expression unreadable, but Jane noticed the way her fingers tapped nervously against the table, a subtle sign of her anxiety. Dr. Thornton was muttering to himself, his hands trembling as he adjusted his glasses. Lady Barrington, however, appeared calm, though Jane could see the tension in the way she held herself, her back ramrod straight, her eyes darting around the room. Jane knew that she needed to start the interviews, but she wanted to observe the group a bit longer before making her move. She positioned herself near the entrance, where she could keep an eye on the entire room. She noticed that Colonel Hargrove had also taken a seat. The colonel was a man of action, and she could see that he was not comfortable sitting idly by while the situation unfolded. His eyes met hers across the room, and he gave her a curt nod, a silent acknowledgement that he was ready to assist if needed. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden commotion near the entrance. A group of museum staff had arrived, led by one of the security officers, a burly man with a stern expression. He approached Jane, his voice low and urgent. "Miss Parsons, we've searched the immediate area, but there's no sign of the scepter," he said, his brow furrowed in frustration. "Whoever took it knew what they were doing. They must have had help from the inside." Jane nodded, her suspicions confirmed. The theft had been too clean, too precise, to have been the work of a single person. But the question remained, who had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to carry out such a daring heist? She needed to begin the interviews, to dig deeper into the motivations and alibis of those closest to the artifact. But as she prepared to make her move, a sudden cry rang out from the far end of the dining hall, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. Jane rushed toward the commotion. The guests had risen from their seats, their faces a mix of fear and confusion. In the center of the room, a figure lay sprawled on the floor, unmoving. It was Lord Marbury. Jane pressed her fingers against his neck in search of a pulse. But there was nothing. Lord Marbury was dead. Jane knew that the thief was still among them, and now they had resorted to murder to cover their tracks. Chapter 4. The First Clues. The museum staff had quickly formed a perimeter around the body, keeping the panicked guests at bay. Lord Henry Fitzwilliam, the curator, was among them, his face pale and drawn as he struggled to maintain control of the situation. His earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by a look of helpless despair. He turned to Jane, his eyes pleading for guidance. "What do we do, Miss Parsons?" he asked, his voice trembling. Jane took a deep breath. "We need to secure the scene," she said firmly. "No one should be allowed to leave the dining hall until we've had a chance to examine the body and gather evidence. I'll need the museum's security team to help with the search for the scepter and to keep the guests contained. We can't afford to let anyone slip away." Lord Fitzwilliam nodded, clearly relieved to have someone take charge. He quickly relayed Jane's instructions to the security team, who began to move the guests to one side of the room, creating a clear space around Lord Marbury's body. Lord Marbury's death had been sudden and violent. His body lay sprawled on the floor, his face frozen in an expression of shock and pain. There were no obvious signs of struggle, no cuts or bruises, no broken glass or overturned furniture to suggest a fight. It was as if he had simply collapsed. Jane began her examination with the most obvious possibilities. Poison was a likely culprit in a case like this, where the victim had shown no outward signs of injury. She shifted her attention to his clothing. Lord Marbury was dressed in a finely tailored suit, the kind one would expect at an event of this caliber. She checked his pockets, feeling for anything out of place. An empty vial, a piece of paper, anything that might provide a clue. Her fingers brushed against something small and hard, and she carefully pulled it out. It was a crumpled piece of paper, torn at the edges as if it had been hastily ripped from a larger document. She unfolded the paper and scanned the contents. The writing was smudged, but she could make out a few words. Meeting, tonight, and urgent. There was no signature, no indication of who had written the note or to whom it had been addressed, but the fact that Lord Marbury had it in his possession suggested that he had been involved in something clandestine, and perhaps dangerous. Before she could dwell on the note further, her attention was drawn to a faint, almost imperceptible odor that lingered around the body. It was a sweet, cloying scent, one that she recognized instantly: bitter almonds, the smell of cyanide. Her suspicions were confirmed. A fast-acting poison had been used to kill Lord Marbury. Cyanide was a favorite among assassins for its lethal efficiency and the difficulty in detecting it after the fact. The fact that the smell was still faintly present indicated that the poison had been administered recently, likely within the last hour. Her eyes moved to the scene around the body, searching for anything that might have been used to deliver the poison. It was then that she noticed a small, almost unremarkable object lying near Lord Marbury's hand. A cufflink, made of polished silver, with an intricate design engraved on its surface. Jane picked it up, turning it over in her hand. It didn't match the cufflinks that Lord Marbury was wearing, which meant it must have belonged to someone else, someone who had been close enough to the victim to leave it behind. The design was distinctive, a pattern that looked like a family crest, but she couldn't immediately place it. She carefully placed the cufflink in a handkerchief, tucking it into her pocket. It was a small clue, but it could prove crucial in identifying the killer. The poison suggested a premeditated murder, one that required access to a lethal substance and the means to deliver it discreetly. The cufflink pointed to a suspect, or at the very least, someone who had been in close proximity to Lord Marbury before his death. Jane turned to see Colonel William Hargrove, his expression as stern and unreadable as ever. He looked down at Lord Marbury's body, then back at Jane, his eyes narrowing slightly. "A nasty business," he said, his voice low. "But I can't say I'm surprised. Marbury had a lot of enemies." "Enemies?" she prompted, keeping her tone neutral. "Who would want him dead?" Hargrove shrugged. "Marbury was an art dealer, but he was also a schemer. He had his fingers in a lot of pies, some of them less savory than others. He wasn't above using blackmail or threats to get what he wanted. Plenty of people would have been happy to see him gone." Lord Marbury's reputation as a ruthless art dealer was well known, but she hadn't realized the extent of his dealings. If he had been involved in blackmail or other illegal activities, it could have given someone a powerful motive to kill him. "Do you think his death is connected to the theft of the scepter?" Jane asked, watching Hargrove closely for his reaction. The colonel hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for Jane to notice. "It's possible," he said carefully. "The scepter is worth a fortune, not just in terms of money, but also in terms of power. Whoever stole it might have seen Marbury as a threat, someone who could expose them or claim the artifact for himself." Jane nodded. The colonel was holding something back. She decided to change tactics, steering the conversation in a different direction. "What brings you here tonight, Colonel? I wasn't expecting to see you at an art gala." Hargrove's eyes flickered. "I was invited," he said simply. "Lord Fitzwilliam thought it would be good to have someone with my experience on hand, given the importance of the scepter." It was a plausible explanation, but Jane wasn't entirely convinced. Before she could question him further, the sound of footsteps approached, and Jane turned to see Dr. Reginald Thornton hurrying toward them, his face pale and anxious. "Miss Parsons, is it true? Lord Marbury? He's really—" Jane nodded. "I'm afraid so, Dr. Thornton. Lord Marbury is dead. It appears he was poisoned." Dr. Thornton's hands trembled as he took off his glasses, wiping them with a handkerchief. This is terrible. How could this happen? Who would do such a thing?" "That's what I'm trying to find out," Jane said, her gaze steady. "Dr. Thornton, I need to ask you some questions. You were one of the last people to speak with Lord Marbury before his death. Did you notice anything unusual? Did he say anything that might help us understand what happened?" Thornton shook his head. "No, nothing. We were discussing the scepter, as we have been all evening. He seemed perfectly fine, though he was preoccupied. I thought he was just anxious about the scepter's unveiling, but now—" "Thank you, Dr. Thornton," she said, keeping her voice calm. "Please stay here in the dining hall. We'll need to speak with everyone as we continue our investigation." Thornton nodded numbly, his eyes darting nervously around the room as he moved to join the other guests. The historian's reaction seemed genuine, but she couldn't rule him out as a suspect. He had the knowledge and the access to both the scepter and Lord Marbury, and his intense interest in the artifact made him a person of interest. As Jane turned back to Lord Marbury's body, she noticed that Colonel Hargrove had stepped away, his gaze fixed on something, or someone, across the room. Jane followed his line of sight and saw Countess Evelina von Habsburg standing near one of the large windows, her back turned to the rest of the guests. The cufflink she had found could provide a crucial link to the killer, but she needed to find out who it belonged to. She made a mental note to show the cufflink to Lord Fitzwilliam as soon as possible. But before she could take another step, a sudden shrill scream pierced the air. It came from the far corner of the room, where Lady Isabella Barrington stood, her face ashen, her hands trembling as she pointed toward the wall behind her. Jane's hurried toward the scene. When she reached Lady Barrington, the socialite's eyes were wide with terror, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. There's blood," she whispered, her voice trembling. "On the wall." Jane followed her gaze. There, on the richly wallpapered surface, was a small, dark smear of blood. The blood was fresh. The presence of blood suggested that Lord Marbury's death had been more violent than she had initially thought. She turned to Lady Barrington. "Lady Barrington, did you see anyone near this wall before you noticed the blood?" The socialite shook her head, her hands still trembling. "No, I was just standing here and then I saw it." The blood could have come from Lord Marbury, but it could also belong to the killer, someone who had been injured during the crime and had inadvertently left a trace behind. She needed to find the source of the blood and determine its significance. But more importantly, she needed to understand how it connected to the theft of the scepter. Chapter 5. Secrets Unveiled. Jane had already discovered a few crucial clues: the smell of cyanide, the mysterious cufflink, the blood on the wall. But the puzzle was far from complete. Her first priority was to identify the owner of the cufflink. She approached Lord Henry Fitzwilliam, who was standing near the entrance, speaking in low tones with one of the museum's security officers. "Lord Fitzwilliam," she began, pulling the cufflink from her pocket and holding it out to him. "I found this near Lord Marbury's body. Do you recognize the design?" Fitzwilliam's eyes widened as he took the cufflink from her, turning it over in his hands. After a moment, he looked up at Jane, his expression troubled. "This is the Barrington family crest," he said slowly. "It belongs to Lady Isabella Barrington." Jane nodded, her mind racing. She found Lady Barrington seated at one of the long tables, her posture stiff, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "Lady Barrington," Jane said softly as she took a seat beside her, "I need to ask you a few questions." The socialite hesitated, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. "Of course, Miss Parsons," she replied, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "But I don't know how much help I can be. This whole situation is terribly upsetting." "I understand," Jane said, her tone gentle but firm. "But I need you to be honest with me. Your family's cufflink was found near Lord Marbury's body. Can you explain how it might have gotten there?" Lady Barrington's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. "My cufflink? Near Lord Marbury? I don't understand how that's possible." "Lady Barrington," she said gently, "this is a serious matter. Lord Marbury is dead, and your cufflink was found at the scene. I need you to think carefully. Were you near Lord Marbury at any point this evening? Did you notice anything unusual?" Lady Barrington shook her head, her hands trembling. I didn't speak to him directly, no. I saw him from across the room, but we didn't interact. As for the cufflink, I didn't even realize it was missing. It must have fallen off at some point, but I don't know how it ended up near him." "Is there anyone else who might have had access to your cufflink?" Jane asked. "Anyone who might have taken it without your knowledge?" "No, I don't think so. I mean, it's possible that someone could have taken it, but I can't imagine who would do such a thing. I've been wearing them all evening. I would have noticed if one was missing." "So, what can you tell me about your relationship with Lord Marbury?" Jane asked. "Lord Marbury and I were acquainted, yes," she said carefully. "But we were not close. He was a difficult man, to say the least. Ruthless in his business dealings, and not above using underhanded tactics to get what he wanted." Jane leaned in slightly. "Underhanded tactics? Can you elaborate?" The socialite hesitated, clearly weighing her words. "There were rumors," she said finally. "Rumors that Marbury had a number of people in his pocket. He was known to use blackmail, to get what he wanted, to manipulate situations to his advantage. I'm sure there are many people who would be relieved to see him gone." "Did Lord Marbury have anything to do with the scepter?" Jane asked. "Did he express any interest in it?" Lady Barrington's expression grew wary, but she nodded slowly. "Yes, he did. He was quite taken with it, actually. He mentioned it several times in the days leading up to the gala. He even hinted that he might make an offer to purchase it, though I'm not sure how serious he was." "Thank you, Lady Barrington," Jane said, rising to her feet. "I may need to speak with you again later, but for now, please remain here." Lady Barrington nodded, though her expression remained troubled. Her next stop was Countess Evelina von Habsburg, who was still standing near the window, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed on the darkness outside. It was time to find out what those emotions were, and whether they had anything to do with Lord Marbury's death. "Countess," Jane began as she approached, "may I have a word?" The Countess turned slowly, her eyes meeting Jane's with a cold, appraising gaze. "Of course, Detective," the Countess replied smoothly. "I'm sure you have many questions." "I do," Jane said, studying the Countess's expression carefully. "Let's start with your relationship with Lord Marbury. What can you tell me about him?" The Countess's lips curled into a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Lord Marbury was an interesting man," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "Ambitious, cunning, and not without his flaws. But then, who among us is without flaws?" Jane raised an eyebrow at the Countess's evasive answer. "And how did you feel about him personally? Did you have any conflicts?" The Countess's smile faded, replaced by a look of mild annoyance. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Detective, but I had no personal conflict with Lord Marbury. We moved in the same circles, yes, and we were both interested in the acquisition of rare and valuable artifacts. But that's where our interactions ended." Jane wasn't convinced. "What about the scepter?" she asked. "Did you and Lord Marbury ever discuss it?" "We did briefly," she admitted. "He expressed interest in it, as did I, but our discussions were purely professional. I had no reason to harm him, Detective." Jane nodded, though she remained skeptical. "Thank you, Countess," Jane said, stepping back. "I may have more questions later." "Dr. Thornton," Jane called out as she approached. The historian stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes wide with worry. "I need to ask you a few more questions." "Of course, Miss Parsons," Thornton replied. "Anything I can do to help." Jane studied him carefully, noting the way his hands fidgeted nervously. "You mentioned earlier that Lord Marbury seemed preoccupied. Did he say anything specific that concerned you?" Thornton hesitated. "He was worried, I think," he said finally. "Worried about the scepter, about its safety. He didn't go into detail, but he seemed distracted. I thought it was just nerves, but now I'm not so sure." "What about your relationship with Lord Marbury?" Jane asked, keeping her tone neutral. "Were the two of you close?" Thornton shook his head quickly. "No, not close. We were colleagues, nothing more. He was difficult to work with, to be honest. Always pushing for more, always trying to get ahead. But we weren't friends, if that's what you're asking." "Did you see anything unusual tonight?" she pressed. Thornton hesitated again. I'm not sure," he stammered. "There was a lot going on, a lot of people moving around. I thought I saw someone near the scepter before it was taken, but it was so chaotic. I can't be certain." Jane frowned, sensing that Thornton was hiding something more. "Who did you see, Dr. Thornton?" she asked, her voice firm. "It's important that you tell me the truth." Thornton swallowed hard. "I thought I saw Lady Barrington near the scepter, just before the lights flickered. But I didn't think much of it at the time. Everyone was moving around, and it was dark. I could be wrong." As she moved through the room, her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden commotion. A group had gathered around a small, dark object lying on the floor, half hidden beneath one of the tables. Jane knelt down to examine it. It was a vial made of dark glass, with a faint residue clinging to the inside. She carefully placed the vial in her handkerchief. The discovery of the vial was a crucial piece of evidence, one that could help her identify the killer. Chapter 6. The Unexpected Murder. The guests, who had been trying to maintain some semblance of composure, were now on edge. Whispers filled the air, and more than a few nervous glances were cast in Jane's direction. The realization that a killer was in their midst was slowly sinking in, and with it came a palpable sense of fear. With the vial now secured, Jane decided it was time to intensify her investigation. She needed to confront the suspects directly, to push them harder and see if she could break through their carefully constructed facades. She began with Lady Isabella Barrington. The revelation that her cufflink had been found near Lord Marbury's body, combined with Dr. Thornton's claim that he had seen her near the sceptre just before it disappeared, made her a prime suspect. Jane found Lady Barrington seated alone at one of the tables, her earlier composure now replaced by a look of deep worry. Her hands, which had trembled slightly before, were now clasped tightly together in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. "Lady Barrington," Jane said, "I need to speak with you again. There are some new developments that we need to discuss." The socialite looked up at Jane. "Of course, Miss Parsons," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to help in any way I can. I've been told that you were seen near the sceptre just before the lights flickered and it was stolen," Jane began, watching for any reaction. "Can you explain what you were doing at that time?" Lady Barrington's eyes widened further, and she shook her head vehemently. No, that's not true. I may have been near the display at some point, but it was only because I wanted to get a closer look. Everyone was admiring it, and I was curious. But I didn't touch it, I swear." "Dr. Thornton mentioned that he saw you near the sceptre," Jane said. "He seemed unsure at first, but now that I've had a chance to speak with him again, he's certain that it was you. Why would he say that if it weren't true?" Lady Barrington's face flushed with panic. "I don't know. Perhaps he's mistaken, or perhaps someone else was there and he confused me with them. I didn't do anything, Miss Parsons. I wouldn't know the first thing about stealing something like that." Jane leaned forward slightly, her gaze intense. "And yet your cufflink was found near Lord Marbury's body. How do you explain that?" The socialite's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she seemed on the verge of tears. I don't know how that happened. I must have lost it at some point during the evening, but I didn't even realize it was missing until you mentioned it. Please, Miss Parsons, you have to believe me. I would never hurt anyone." Before Jane could press further, a sudden shout echoed from the far side of the room, followed by the sound of something heavy crashing to the floor. She turned just in time to see a figure collapse to the ground, their body crumpling in a heap. It was Dr. Reginald Thornton. The historian lay motionless on the floor, his glasses askew, his face drained of color. Jane rushed to his side, her fingers searching for a pulse, but it was too late. Dr. Thornton was dead. As Jane examined Dr. Thornton's body, she noticed something peculiar, a small puncture mark on his neck, just below the ear. The skin around the wound was slightly reddened, and Jane could see a tiny droplet of blood beginning to form. The mark was too small to have been caused by a knife or any conventional weapon, but it was unmistakable. A needle puncture. Poison. Again. The murder of Lord Marbury had been executed with poison, and now Dr. Thornton had been killed in a similar fashion. But this time, the poison had been delivered through a needle, a method that required close proximity and a steady hand. The killer had to be someone who could move through the room without attracting attention, someone who could strike quickly and then vanish before anyone noticed. Jane turned to Lord Fitzwilliam, who was standing nearby. "We need to secure the exits and make sure no one leaves this hall," she said urgently. "The killer is still among us, and we can't let them escape." Fitzwilliam nodded numbly, and he quickly relayed Jane's orders to the museum's security team. Looking at the dead doctor's body, Jane noticed a small, crumpled piece of paper sticking out of his jacket pocket. She carefully retrieved it, unfolding the paper to reveal a hastily scribbled note. The handwriting was shaky, as if written in a hurry, and the words were barely legible. But Jane could make out enough to understand the significance. "They know. Must act quickly. Marbury, safe house." She quickly pocketed the note, her mind racing. The mention of a safe house suggested that there was more to this mystery than met the eye. As Jane stood there, her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of someone approaching. She turned to see Countess Evelina von Habsburg, her expression a mixture of fear and anger. "Miss Parsons," the Countess said, her voice low and urgent, We need to speak. Now. Once they were away from the prying eyes and ears of the other guests, Jane turned to the Countess. What is it, Countess? What do you need to tell me? The Countess hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as if to make sure they weren't being watched. There are things you don't know, Miss Parsons, she said quietly. Things that are far more dangerous than you realize. Go on, she urged, keeping her tone neutral. The Countess took a deep breath, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. Lord Marbury and Dr. Thornton were involved in something that goes beyond just the scepter. They were working with a group, a clandestine organization that deals in sensitive matters. The Countess shook her head. I don't know all the details, but I know that they were involved in securing and protecting certain artifacts that hold great power and significance. The scepter was one of those artifacts. And you, Jane asked, her gaze piercing, how are you involved in all of this? The Countess's expression darkened, and for a moment, Jane saw a flicker of something like regret. I've been involved in these circles for a long time, Miss Parsons. My family has connections, and I've used those connections to acquire certain items. The scepter was meant to be part of my collection, but Marbury and Thornton were determined to keep it out of my hands. But I didn't kill them, Miss Parsons. I swear it. I had no reason to. My interests were purely professional. But there are others who would stop at nothing to get their hands on the scepter. I believe that's what happened tonight. As Jane pondered these questions, the Countess leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. There's more, Miss Parsons. The safe house mentioned in Thornton's note. I know where it is. It's a location used by the organization to store and protect sensitive items. If you want to find the scepter, that's where you need to go. I need you to take me there, Jane said, her voice firm. We don't have much time. The Countess hesitated, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. Very well, she said finally. But be warned, Miss Parsons, this will not be an easy task. The organization has many enemies, and they won't hesitate to kill anyone who gets in their way. Jane nodded, her resolve unshaken. I understand the risks, Countess, but I'm not backing down. Too many lives have been lost already. We need to put an end to this. The Countess nodded, and together they began to make their way toward the museum's exit. As they reached the doors, Jane turned to Lord Fitzwilliam. I need you to keep everyone here. No one leaves until I return. Fitzwilliam nodded. The safe house was located in a narrow alley, hidden away from the prying eyes of the public. The building itself was nondescript, its facade blending in with the surrounding structures. The Countess led the way, her steps quick and determined. She produced a key from her pocket and unlocked the door, pushing it open with a creak. Tea. The safe house was small, with shelves lining the walls, each one filled with various artifacts and documents. The room was a treasure trove of history, but Jane's attention was immediately drawn to the center of the room, where a large, reinforced safe stood. The Countess moved to the safe, her hands trembling slightly as she began to work the combination. Inside was revealed the scepter. But as Jane reached for the scepter, her eyes narrowing as she took a closer look at the artifact. Something wasn't right. The scepter was too perfect, too pristine. There were no signs of wear, no marks of age or use. It was as if the scepter had been crafted only recently, a replica designed to fool those who sought it. This isn't the real scepter, Jane said. It's a fake. The Countess's expression darkened, and Jane could see the anger and frustration in her eyes. Damn them, she muttered. They've taken the real scepter. They must have known we were coming. We need to get out of here, Jane said urgently. We're not safe. But before they could move, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside. The door to the safe house burst open, and Jane barely had time to react as a figure lunged at her, a knife flashing in the dim light. She sidestepped the attack. Finally, with a desperate move, Jane managed to knock the knife from her attacker's hand, sending it clattering to the floor. Stop, she commanded, her voice cold and steady. The figure froze, their hands raised in surrender. Jane's breath came in ragged gasps as she took in the sight of her attacker, a man dressed in dark clothing. "Who are you?" Jane demanded, her voice harsh. "Why are you doing this?" The man said nothing, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. And before she could press him further, the sound of more footsteps echoed from the hallway. "Colonel Hargrove," Jane said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" Jane hesitated, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of the situation. Hargrove's presence here was no coincidence. He was involved in the events of the night, but how deep did his involvement go? Was he the mastermind behind the theft and the murders, or was he simply another pawn in a larger game? But before she could act, Hargrove's finger tightened on the trigger, and Jane knew she had no choice. Slowly, she raised her hands. "You've done well, Miss Parsons," Hargrove said, his voice still cold. "But this is where it ends. The scepter is ours now, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." The door burst open once more, and the room was suddenly filled with the presence of several uniformed officers. Hargrove's eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment he seemed uncertain. But Jane knew she had to act quickly. "Arrest them!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the tension. "They're the ones responsible." Hargrove's accomplice was quickly subdued, and Hargrove himself was forced to lower his pistol as the officers closed in around him. As the officers led Hargrove and the other man away, Jane turned to the Countess, who was still visibly shaken. "Are you all right?" she asked. The Countess nodded, though her hands were still trembling. "Yes, I think so. But what about the scepter? The real one?" Jane's expression grew serious. "We'll find it. Hargrove and his accomplice will be questioned, and I'm confident they'll lead us to the real scepter." Chapter 7. The Red Herring. Colonel William Hargrove and his accomplice had been taken into custody, but despite their capture, the scepter was still missing. Hargrove had been a significant player, but he wasn't the one who had orchestrated this elaborate scheme. There was someone else, someone who had planned everything with meticulous precision. As she re-entered the museum, the atmosphere was somber. The guests had been allowed to return to their homes after providing statements, but the staff remained on high alert. Lord Henry Fitzwilliam, the museum's curator, was overseeing the security efforts, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a deep-seated anxiety. "Miss Parsons," Fitzwilliam greeted her as she approached. "Any news from the police?" Jane shook her head. "Not yet. They're questioning Hargrove and his accomplice, but I don't expect them to talk easily." Fitzwilliam nodded. "What do you plan to do next?" Jane considered this for a moment. "I need to go over everything again. Every clue, every piece of evidence. There's something we're missing, something that will lead us to the real culprit. I'll start by re-examining the scene where Lord Marbury and Dr. Thornton were killed." With that, she made her way to the dining hall, the site of the two murders. She carefully traced the path Marbury might have taken before his death. As she moved, she noticed something small and metallic, glinting under one of the tables. Jane examined the syringe. It was small, the kind used for precise, controlled doses of liquid, perfect for administering poison. The needle was still intact, and a faint residue of liquid remained inside the chamber. It was clear that this was the instrument used to deliver the fatal dose. She carefully wrapped the syringe in a clean cloth. The residue could provide a crucial link to the type of poison used, and, possibly, to the person who had administered it. Her next stop was the area where Dr. Thornton had collapsed. As she examined the spot where Thornton had fallen, her gaze was drawn to a small, crumpled piece of paper that had been partially hidden beneath a chair. Jane picked it up, carefully smoothing it out. The paper was a torn page from a notebook, and on it was scrawled text in Dr. Thornton's distinctive handwriting. "Safe house, Marbury knew, secrets buried, trust no one." Next, Jane decided it was time to confront the remaining suspects, Lady Barrington, Countess von Habsburg, and Lord Fitzwilliam. She began with Lady Barrington, who was still in the museum, pacing nervously in one of the side galleries. "Lady Barrington," Jane called as she approached, "I need to speak with you again." The socialite turned. "Miss Parsons, I've told you everything I know. I don't know how my cufflink ended up near Lord Marbury, and I swear I had nothing to do with the scepter's disappearance." Jane studied her carefully, watching for any sign of deceit. "I believe you," she said slowly, "but there's something else we need to discuss. Dr. Thornton, he mentioned seeing you near the scepter just before it disappeared. Can you explain why he would say that?" I don't know. I didn't steal the scepter, Miss Parsons. I went over to look at it, yes, but so did everyone else. Maybe he saw me and assumed I had something to do with it, but I swear I didn't take it." "Did you know that Dr. Thornton was killed with a syringe?" Jane asked suddenly, her voice sharp. "The same kind of syringe that was found near Lord Marbury's body." Lady Barrington's eyes widened in shock, and she took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth. "A syringe? I had no idea. But what does that have to do with me?" Jane leaned in slightly, her gaze piercing. "Everything. The syringe was left behind, almost as if someone wanted us to find it, just like your cufflink. It's almost as if someone is trying to frame you, Lady Barrington." The socialite's face turned ashen. "No, I would never. I couldn't. Please, Miss Parsons, you have to believe me." With no new leads from Lady Barrington, Jane decided to move on to Countess von Habsburg. "Countess," Jane greeted her, "I need to ask you a few more questions." The Countess inclined her head slightly, her eyes unreadable. "Of course, Miss Parsons. What do you wish to know?" Jane wasted no time. "What can you tell me about your connection to Lord Marbury and Dr. Thornton? You mentioned earlier that you were aware of their involvement in a clandestine organization. What was your role in all of this?" The Countess's expression didn't change. "I was aware of their activities, yes, but I was not directly involved. My interests lie in acquiring and preserving valuable artifacts, not in the political machinations that Marbury and Thornton were engaged in." Jane raised an eyebrow. "Political machinations? What do you mean?" The Countess hesitated. "Marbury and Thornton were part of a group that sought to control certain artifacts for their own purposes that went beyond mere collection. They believed that some of these artifacts held power that could be used to influence events, to shape history." "Do you know who else was involved in this group?" Jane asked. The Countess shook her head. "No, I don't. Marbury and Thornton were secretive, even with those they trusted. But I do know that they were not alone. There were others, people who would stop at nothing to obtain the scepter." "Countess," Jane said carefully, "is there anyone you suspect? Anyone who might have been working with Marbury and Thornton, or who might have had a motive to kill them?" The Countess hesitated again, and Jane could see the internal struggle in her eyes. "I don't know, Miss Parsons. I truly don't. But I do know that whoever is behind this is dangerous, and they will stop at nothing to achieve their goals." Her final stop was Lord Fitzwilliam, who was overseeing the security efforts near the museum's entrance. "Lord Fitzwilliam," Jane greeted him, "I need to speak with you in private." Fitzwilliam nodded, gesturing for one of the security officers to take his place. He led Jane to a small private office near the entrance, closing the door behind them. "What is it, Miss Parsons?" Fitzwilliam asked, his voice weary. "Have you found something new?" Jane studied him carefully, her gaze searching. "I've uncovered some new information, yes, but I need your help to make sense of it. You've been involved in the art world for a long time, Lord Fitzwilliam. What can you tell me about the idea that some artifacts hold power that could be used for political purposes?" Fitzwilliam's eyes widened in surprise, and he took a step back, his expression troubled. "Miss Parsons, that's a dangerous line of inquiry. There are people, powerful people, who believe in such things. But it's all superstition, I assure you. The scepter is a valuable artifact, yes, but it has no special powers." "Lord Fitzwilliam," she said slowly, "do you know who might have wanted to steal the scepter? Who might have had the knowledge and resources to carry out such a plan? Fitzwilliam's hands trembled slightly. I don't know, Miss Parsons. There are many who would covet such an artifact, but none that I can name. Lord Fitzwilliam, she said, her voice sharp, where were you when the lights flickered and the scepter was stolen? Fitzwilliam's eyes widened in shock, and he seemed genuinely stunned by the question. I was near the entrance, speaking with some of the guests. I didn't see anything. When the lights flickered, I assumed it was a technical issue. By the time I realized what had happened, the scepter was already gone. Thank you, Lord Fitzwilliam, Jane said finally. Please stay here and continue overseeing the security efforts. I'll let you know if I uncover anything else. Chapter 8. A Race Against Time. The interviews Jane had conducted with Lady Barrington, Countess von Habsburg, and Lord Fitzwilliam had provided valuable insights, but they had also raised more questions than answers. She mentally reviewed the clues she had gathered: the stolen scepter, the murders of Lord Marbury and Dr. Thornton, the cryptic note about a safe house, the syringe used to kill Thornton, and the discovery of the fake scepter at the supposed safe house. Her next destination was the police station, where Colonel Hargrove and his accomplice were being held. Jane needed to question them directly, to see if she could extract any useful information. The safe house had been a dead end, but Hargrove's involvement suggested that he might know where the real scepter was hidden, or at least who had taken it. When she arrived at the station, Jane was greeted by Inspector James Hargrave, a veteran of the force who had been overseeing the investigation in conjunction with her own efforts. Parsons, Hargrave greeted her with a nod. You're just in time. We've got Hargrove in the interrogation room, but he's not talking. Figured you might want to take a crack at him. Jane nodded. I need to know what he knows, Inspector. We're running out of time. Hargrave gestured for her to follow him. Let's see if we can loosen his tongue. He's a tough one, but everyone's got a breaking point. Jane took a seat across from him, her gaze steady. Hargrave remained standing near the door, his arms crossed as he watched the exchange. Colonel Hargrove, Jane began, her tone measured. We both know you're in a difficult position. You've been caught red-handed, and your accomplice has already implicated you in the theft of the scepter. But you and I both know that you're not the mastermind behind this operation. Hargrove spoke, his voice low. You're wasting your time, Miss Parsons. I have nothing to say to you. Let me tell you what I think, Jane said, her tone steady. I think you were brought into this operation because of your military background, your skills and your connections. You were useful to them, but only as long as you served their purpose. The moment you became a liability, they were prepared to cut you loose. The fake scepter we found at the safe house, that was meant to throw us off the trail, to buy them more time, and now you're sitting here, taking the blame, while they make off with the real prize. You're not the mastermind, Colonel, she continued, but you know who is. You know who set this all up, who orchestrated the murders of Lord Marbury and Dr. Thornton, who stole the scepter. There was a long silence as Hargrove stared at Jane. Finally, he spoke. You're right, Miss Parsons. I wasn't the one who planned this, but I knew what I was getting into. I'm no fool. Jane nodded, her expression encouraging. Then help us, Colonel. Help us stop them before it's too late. Hargrove hesitated. It was Fitzwilliam, he said quietly. Lord Henry Fitzwilliam. He's the one who set it all up. It seemed almost unbelievable, but as she thought back over the events of the night, the pieces began to fall into place. Fitzwilliam had been in the perfect position to plan and execute the theft. He had access to the museum security systems, he knew the layout of the building, and he had the trust of everyone involved. He had been there from the beginning, guiding the investigation, subtly steering it away from himself. He had likely planned to sell the scepter to the highest bidder, or perhaps use it for some other purpose, one that required the deaths of Lord Marbury and Dr. Thornton to keep the secret. But there was still one crucial piece missing: the location of the real scepter. Fitzwilliam must have hidden it somewhere, but where? Jane turned back to Hargrove. Where is the scepter, Colonel? Where did Fitzwilliam hide it? Hargrove shook his head, his expression one of frustration. I don't know. He never told me. All I know is that he planned to meet with a buyer. Someone from abroad, someone with deep pockets. The meeting was supposed to take place tonight. Think, Colonel, Jane urged. Where would Fitzwilliam arrange a meeting like this? Hargrove frowned, clearly struggling to remember. He mentioned a place, a location he said was perfect for this kind of deal. I think it was an old manor house just outside the city called Ash something. He said it was abandoned, but still in good condition. He liked the idea of the symbolism, he said. Jane's mind immediately went to the possibilities. There were several old manor houses in the country surrounding London, but one in particular stood out, Ashcroft Manor, a large estate that had been abandoned for decades, its once grand halls now silent and empty. Jane stood. Thank you, Colonel. You've done the right thing. I hope you can stop him, Miss Parsons. He's dangerous, and he's desperate. Jane nodded, then turned to Hargrave. We need to move quickly, Inspector. I'm heading to Ashcroft Manor. I need backup. Hargrave didn't hesitate. I'll assemble a team. We'll be right behind you. With that, Jane left the police station. The ride to Ashcroft Manor would take some time, but she couldn't afford to waste a single minute. She needed to get there before Fitzwilliam made the exchange, before the scepter was lost forever. Ashcroft Manor loomed on the horizon, its once grand facade now crumbling, surrounded by overgrown gardens and dense woods. Jane's senses were on high alert as she entered the building. As she moved deeper into the manor, the sound of voices reached her ears, low, murmured tones that echoed through the empty halls. She followed the sound to a large, grand hall. Inside, she saw them, Fitzwilliam, standing with his back to her, and another man, tall, well-dressed, and clearly foreign, his accent giving away his identity as the buyer. On a table between them lay the scepter, its golden shaft gleaming faintly in the dim light. Who's there? Fitzwilliam called out, his voice sharp with suspicion. Jane knew she couldn't remain hidden any longer. Don't move, Fitzwilliam, Jane ordered. It's over. Fitzwilliam's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in anger as he realized who had interrupted his deal. You don't know what you're doing, Miss Parsons. I know exactly what I'm doing. You've orchestrated a series of murders, stolen a priceless artifact, and tried to cover your tracks. But it's over now. You're finished. Fitzwilliam's eyes burned with hatred, but he knew he was beaten. The buyer, too, slowly raised his hands, recognizing that the deal had gone south. But just as Jane thought she had the situation under control, she heard the distant sound of footsteps, multiple sets approaching fast. Fitzwilliam had planned for this. He had backup, likely hired thugs who had been waiting in the wings to ensure the deal went smoothly. Jane knew she couldn't handle them all on her own. But just as the situation seemed hopeless, the sound of a police siren pierced the air, followed by the roar of engines. Help had arrived. The police burst through the doors, quickly surrounding Fitzwilliam, the buyer, and Jane. The thugs who had been approaching from the rear froze, realizing they were outmatched. Inspector Hargrave approached Jane, his expression one of respect. Good work, Parsons. We've got them all, and the scepter is secure. Jane nodded. Fitzwilliam was just one part of a larger scheme. There are others out there, people who wanted the scepter for reasons we still don't fully understand. We need to dig deeper, find out who's behind this and what they're planning. Hargrave sighed, but there was a determination in his eyes. We'll get to the bottom of it, but for now, let's get this artifact back where it belongs. Chapter 9. The Revelation. The streets of London had regained their typical hustle and bustle by the time Jane Parsons arrived back at the British Museum of Arts. She was greeted by Lord Fitzwilliam's replacement, Lady Margaret Abernathy, a no-nonsense woman in her late 50s with a sharp mind and a reputation for integrity. Lady Abernathy had been appointed as interim curator following Fitzwilliam's arrest. and Jane had worked with her on a few occasions in the past. "Miss Parsons," Lady Abernathy greeted her. "I've been briefed on the situation. I understand you've recovered the scepter." Jane nodded. "Yes, it's been secured, but I'm afraid that's not the end of it. Fitzwilliam hinted at something larger, an ongoing conspiracy that involves more than just the theft of the scepter. We need to go through Fitzwilliam's records, his correspondence, anything that might give us a clue about what he was involved in. We've already begun cataloguing his personal effects, but there's a lot to sort through. Let's start with his office. If Fitzwilliam was the mastermind, then he would have left something behind. Notes, documents, anything that might point us in the right direction." Lady Abernathy nodded, leading Jane through the grand halls of the museum toward Fitzwilliam's private office. Tea. When they reached Fitzwilliam's office, Lady Abernathy unlocked the door and pushed it open. Jane wasted no time, immediately moving to the desk and beginning to sift through the documents. Lady Abernathy joined her, carefully examining the books on the shelves and the contents of the desk drawers. It was Jane who made the first significant discovery. Among the papers on Fitzwilliam's desk, she found a series of letters written in a coded script. The letters were addressed to Fitzwilliam, but the sender's name was absent, replaced by a symbol that Jane didn't recognize, an intricately designed sigil that looked almost ancient. "Lady Abernathy," Jane called out, holding up one of the letters. "Take a look at this." The curator moved to Jane's side, examining the letter with a keen eye. "That symbol," she murmured. "I've seen it before. It's an old alchemical symbol, often associated with secret societies and occult practices. But why would Fitzwilliam be receiving letters in a coded script? And what does this have to do with the scepter?" "We need to decode these letters," Jane said. "Whatever is in them could be the key to understanding what's really going on." Lady Abernathy nodded. "There are a few scholars I can contact, experts in ancient codes and cryptography, but it will take time." And Jane's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching the office. A moment later, Inspector Hargrave appeared in the doorway, his expression grave. "Parsons," he said, his tone serious, "we've got a problem. We've been going through Fitzwilliam's financial records, and it looks like he was funneling money into several offshore accounts. But here's the kicker. Those accounts have been drained in the past 24 hours. Jane's heart sank. "Someone's covering their tracks." "Exactly," Hargrave confirmed. "We've also identified several large withdrawals from those accounts, all made in the last few days. It looks like Fitzwilliam was preparing for a quick exit. He must have known the net was closing in." As Lady Abernathy left to contact the experts, Jane turned back to Hargrave. "We also need to keep a close watch on Fitzwilliam. He's our only direct link to this conspiracy, and I have a feeling he knows more than he's letting on. If he gets any visitors, or if he tries to make contact with anyone, we need to know about it immediately." Hargrave nodded. "I'll have my men on it. We'll make sure he doesn't slip through our fingers." Hours passed as Jane and Hargrave continued their investigation, combing through Fitzwilliam's records, cross-referencing names, dates, and locations. The cryptographers arrived and began their work on the letters. It was late in the afternoon when one of the cryptographers approached Jane, holding a sheet of paper. "Miss Parsons," the cryptographer said, "I think we've got something." The cryptographer had managed to decode a portion of one of the letters. "The scepter is the key. Without it, the ritual cannot be completed. The alignment is near, and the time grows short. We must move quickly, or all will be lost." Jane stared at the decoded message. The mention of a ritual and an alignment suggested something far darker than she had anticipated, something that went beyond mere greed or ambition. "What do you make of this?" Jane asked, handing the paper to Hargrave. The inspector read the message, his expression growing grim. "It sounds like they're planning something big. But what kind of ritual, and what's this alignment they're talking about?" Jane turned back to the cryptographer. "Can you decode the rest of the letters? We need to know everything they've been planning." The cryptographer nodded. "We're working as fast as we can. There are several more letters, and each one seems to contain a piece of the puzzle. It's going to take some time, but we'll get it done." Hours passed, and the tension in the room grew with each passing minute. The cryptographers worked tirelessly. Finally, as the sun began to set, the lead cryptographer approached Jane once more, her expression somber. "We've decoded most of the letters," she said quietly, handing Jane a stack of papers. "It's worse than we thought." The references to an alignment were repeated throughout the letters, along with mentions of specific dates and locations. One letter, in particular, caught Jane's attention. It was dated only a few weeks ago, and it contained detailed instructions for the ritual, along with a chilling final sentence. "The ritual must be completed on the night of the alignment, or all our efforts will be for naught. The scepter will unlock the power we seek, and the world will be changed forever." "We need to move now," Jane said urgently, turning to Hargrave. "They're planning to perform this ritual tonight, and they're going to use the scepter to do it. We can't let that happen." Hargrave didn't hesitate. "Where do we need to go?" Jane scanned the letters, her eyes searching for any mention of a location. Finally, she found it, a reference to a place known as Blackmore Abbey, an ancient, abandoned monastery located in the remote countryside. "Blackmore Abbey," Jane said, her voice filled with determination. "That's where they're going to be. We need to get there before they can start the ritual." Hargrave nodded. "We'll have a team ready to move out in 10 minutes. This ends tonight, Parsons." Chapter 10. The Final Confrontation. Blackmore Abbey, an ancient and abandoned monastery, shrouded in mystery and legend, had long been considered a place of dark secrets. As the convoy approached the abbey, the weather took a sudden turn for the worse. Dark clouds gathered overhead, and a cold wind began to howl through the trees, carrying with it the promise of a storm. "We're almost there," Inspector Hargrave said. "We'll be at the abbey in a few minutes." The convoy came to a stop, just outside the abbey's gate, where the overgrown remnants of a once grand courtyard stretched out before them. "This place gives me the creeps," one of the officers muttered as they surveyed the abbey's imposing facade. "All right, everyone," Hargrave said, his voice cutting through the wind. "We move in fast and secure the area. Parsons, you take point. Let's get this done." Jane nodded. She led the way through the gate, her footsteps nearly silent on the cracked stones beneath her feet. The other officers followed closely, their weapons drawn, their eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Jane pushed open the heavy wooden door that led into the abbey's main hall. The door creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty space beyond. The hall was vast, its high ceiling supported by stone columns that had stood for centuries. The floor was covered in dust, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. As they moved deeper into the abbey, the sound of chanting reached Jane's ears, low, rhythmic, and filled with an eerie power. The chanting led them to a set of heavy double doors at the far end of the hall. The doors were slightly ajar, and the faint glow of candlelight spilled out from within. Jane pushed the doors open wider, revealing the scene inside. The room beyond was a large, circular chamber, its walls lined with ancient tapestries depicting scenes of religious and occult significance. In the center of the chamber, a group of figures stood in a circle, their heads bowed in concentration as they chanted in unison. In the center of the circle, placed on an ornate stone pedestal, was the scepter. The real scepter. Among the chanting figures were men and women Jane didn't recognize, but who were clearly part of the same secretive organization. They were dressed in dark robes, their faces obscured by hoods, their voices rising and falling in a rhythmic chant that seemed to reverberate through the very air. "Stop!" Jane's voice rang out, cutting through the chanting like a knife. The figures in the circle froze, their heads snapping up to look at her with eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. The police moved in quickly to arrest them all. Hargrave looked at Jane. "Good work, Parsons," he said. "You stopped whatever madness they were trying to unleash." Jane nodded, but her gaze remained fixed on the scepter. "We need to secure it," she said quietly. "Make sure it's never used like this again." Hargrave nodded in agreement. "We'll get it back to the museum, where it belongs, and this time it'll be under the highest security." Outside the Abbey, the convoy of police vehicles was waiting, ready to transport the scepter and the prisoners back to London. Jane took a deep breath as she stepped into the cool air.